Hello and welcome to episode 70 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Bobonis, and joining me today is Peter Jennings, PSM, Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and Knight of the French National Order of the Legion of Honor. We will be talking to Peter about what else? Australia's new nuclear submarines. Peter Jennings, how are you?
Salvatore, I'm well. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thanks for joining us. On September 18th, France recalled its ambassador, Jean-Pierre Thibault, from Canberra for consultations. Did it also revoke your membership in the Legion of Honor?
Well, I've been wondering if I'd get a letter from the Elysee Palace, Salvatore. It hasn't happened yet, and I don't think it will. The truth of the matter is we didn't handle the end of that relationship well over the French submarine. But on the other hand, they were out of contract and they didn't win a contract to take the program to the next stage. So these things happen in defence procurements. I can appreciate their unhappiness, but really the more important thing here is how do we get that bilateral relationship back on track? Because it's in the interests of both countries that we have a good relationship. That'll take some time, but I think once we let the dust settle, what we'll have is a reasonable Australia-French relationship, and we'll have moved on to what I think for us is an essential thing to do, which was to look at nuclear propulsion for our submarines.
Well, I'm sure they regret their $90 billion. I'd love to have your $90 billion too. Peter, I'm sure Gallic petulance aside, I'm sure that will eventually heal itself. Tell us about the AUKUS partnership. Is it we hear the word partnership. Is that an alliance? I mean, what is AUKUS?
Well, the first thing it is a massive surprise. I've been working in this town for about 30 years, Salvatore, and I've not seen a secret so well kept as the one which was landed on our laps about 10 days ago or so now. It's clearly the result of about 6 months worth of discussion between the US, the UK and Australia. And now we know why. Back in June this year in Cornwall at the G7 meeting, we had that sort of mysterious story of Boris Johnson sort of crashing what was to be a bilateral meeting between Scott Morrison and Joe Biden. I'd say that was the sort of final sealing of the deal for AUKUS. But as you say, what is it? It's I think at this stage it's an agreement between three heads of government. It's not a formal treaty relationship, and I don't think it ever will be, because for that to happen, it would have to go through the US Congress. I'm unsure that it would actually get that, particularly perhaps after the midterms. So I think we're going to have an informal relationship, an informal understanding, but no less powerful because of that. Because really what we have here is a commitment to much more closely share the science, the technology, the defence industrial capability across the three countries. And that's a really significant development.
Now, the US is already a treaty ally of Australia and a treaty ally of the UK. So you mentioned this AUKUS will not be a formal alliance, but is there any need for it to be an alliance? I mean, even if it were, what would it add?
I think between these three countries in particular, it isn't necessary. We are going to certainly have to have formal agreements around technology sharing, for example, relating to nuclear propulsion. There's no way that could happen without there being very precise expectations set and promises made about how we will handle that technology. I think given the history of the three countries, the longevity of our own defence relationships, which at the least can be traced back to the First World War, that the requirement for an underpinning treaty for AUKUS is not significant. And of course, as you say, there are formal treaty relationships between us and the United States and the UK and the United States, and I think that's sort of sufficient to really cover that spectrum. There was, by the way, no treaty relationship between us and the French. There was a massive series of contracts for the original design of the submarine, but I think between the UK, the US, and Australia, the depth of understanding is such, the trust level is such that AUKUS doesn't need to be formalised, although certain aspects of cooperation that will now happen under AUKUS, they will definitely be formalised.
Well, what are we talking about with cooperation? Because in most of our minds, AUKUS is a submarine procurement deal. What else is there?
There's a lot, and really it was only just because the submarine propulsion element was so significant that the rest kind of got lost in under the main headlines. There is, for example, an agreement that we will now access cruise missiles, which are missiles that have a radius, a range of well over 1,500 kilometres. Australia's never had that type of capability before. That would be big news in its own right. There's agreements to do joint work in developing further military technology, including hypersonics, very fast missile systems, quantum technology, quantum computing technology, and artificial intelligence. And the way I think of it is we're really getting a pooling here of the science and technology know-how of the three countries. Yes, we have shared this type of stuff in the past, but typically they've also been stovepiped a little bit because we're talking about countries protecting some of their most important intellectual property. I think the view is, particularly given the threats that we face, that a pooling of those capabilities across the three countries is going to yield better outcomes for all three of us. And in fact, I imagine some of them will move faster, Salvatore, than the nuclear propulsion. That's at least a 15-year project. In the case of hypersonics, I think we could probably be thinking about fielding hypersonic weapons within sort of five years or so.
Now, Peter, On Liberty is a live show. We run it as a live show in part because our member base is often much more knowledgeable than I am. And it's an opportunity for our members to get in their own questions to our guests. I want to say a quick hello to Antony, Christopher, Chris, to John. We already have questions pouring in. I'll just start off with one from John. It's the most basic of all questions. Does Australia even need submarines? Any submarines? Nuclear or conventional at all?
I think we do. I think there is some attributes that submarines uniquely offer that can't be found through other areas of military technology. And really they are stealth, the ability to deploy a submarine into an area where a potential enemy will have no idea of its location. That has been the sort of the principal strategic value of submarines going back for well over a century. If you combine that with nuclear propulsion, what you then get from that is range, because effectively the energy of a nuclear reactor in a submarine is limitless. So the only thing that limits its range is the ability to keep your crew sane and to keep them fed. Nuclear boats could be at sea underwater for months undetected. So range, stealth. The other thing that nuclear power does is provide you with unlimited speed to get to an area where you want to get and to get away from an area when you need to do so. All of these things, I think, are powerful military attributes. And short of nuclear weapons, which Australia does not want and our government says it has absolutely no interest in, probably the next most useful strategic deterrent you could think of is to have a fleet of those sorts of submarines with the capacity to move Australia's military forces far, far forward in a way that a potential enemy would simply not know about. So yes, in my view, submarines continue to have significant military use, and I think they will do for some decades to come.
Now, Chris is curious if you have any information or insights into just how much it will cost Australia to break the deal with the French.
I don't, and I guess this is something which potentially is going to, may even end up in some sort of legal action, so probably dangerous to speculate on. Where the government had got to with this was that there was a natural breakpoint in between contracts. So a significant amount of development work had been done. We have still well over 100 people in Cherbourg, Australians in Cherbourg, learning the technology of French nuclear submarines construction. And we'd spent quite a few $100 million to get to that point. There was a fresh contract which was about to be signed, which had been pretty hard to negotiate, that had involved, would take us from the design stage pretty much through to the start of construction. And so if our government was ever going to walk from the deal, that was the moment for that to happen. The contract did not get signed. So the Commonwealth is not in contract to Naval Group Australia right now, but there nevertheless will be some pretty difficult unpicking. The French make the observation that they have already shared some significant intellectual property with us in an area which they regard as, very important and secret to their own defence capabilities. So this is going to cost us, I will say, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But just recall, you're talking about a defence budget of about $37 billion a year. So, it's all got to be kept in proportion.
Right. Now, we've been very focused on the AUKUS announcement, and the Australian government seems to have promoted that focus. But this came just before the visit of Marise, Payne and Peter Dutton to Washington for the AUSMIN meetings. Can you explain to us what is AUSMIN and what's been happening in Washington this past week?
So AUSMIN is the annual Australia-US Ministerial Consultations, which was the vehicle that ultimately replaced what used to be a triangular meeting between Australia, New Zealand and the United States, until New Zealand drifted off on its anti-nuclear fantasies in the mid-1980s. So AUSMIN has been around since then as an annual meeting of the Australian Defence and Foreign Minister and the US Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence, which there've been a couple of years where they didn't happen, but they've been very regular in the last 20 years or so. And they are a vehicle for forward planning in terms of a broad cooperation agenda with the United States, but particularly so in defence and intelligence. And again, AUSMIN this year probably definitely overshone a little bit by the announcement of AUKUS, but the AUSMIN meeting itself also announced a raft of further military cooperation between Australia and the United States, which is going to mean more US Marines coming to the top end. It's going to mean a larger, more frequent, more varied presence of of US Air Force aircraft operating in the top end of the country. I think for the first time, we're going to see a significant US Army presence here as opposed to the Marine Corps, and quite likely American naval ships operating out of our major naval bases on both the East and the West Coast. So a substantial step up of bilateral cooperation, a lot of which is really about enabling the US to sustain its military presence in the Indo-Pacific region more effectively, and to also make it possible to disperse what it has at the moment, which is a large number of personnel and forces in a small number of bases, mostly in Japan, South Korea, and in Guam. So this sort of suits American strategy, and it certainly suits Australian strategy because the more we can sustain that American presence, the better it is for our own defence capability, and the more confidence it lends to other countries in Southeast Asia, for example, that there are alternatives for them other than simply subordinating themselves to China, which of course is the other great power really seeking to try and supplant the US in this part of the world. So AUSMIN was significant. Only in this year could it really have been outshone by AUKUS, but that is what happened in DC last week.
Well, another thing being eclipsed last week, I think, was the Quad. Speaking of rising superpowers, Narendra Modi is in the United States, been talking to, I know he's been talking to Kamala Harris. I believe he's probably also had a meeting with Joe Biden. What does the AUKUS partnership, sorry, I don't want to trip over our terms, imply for the future of the Quad?
Well, there's a sort of an alphabet soup of these acronyms now floating around. I think the last time we saw such active alliance building, Salvatore, was probably at the end of the Second World War and into the early 50s, where the sort of the post-war laydown of global security was designed. That's where we get NATO from. That's where we get ANZUS and the US-Japan Treaty, for example. Now we have a string of new acronyms entering the vocabulary. AUKUS we've talked about, but there's also this thing called the Quad, which brings together Australia, Japan, India, and the US. Sort of floated about a decade ago, but at that stage kicked into touch by Australia out of a concern not to be seen to be annoying China. I think we're now at a point where we can take China's annoyance as a given. And what's happened with the Quad is that it's kind of lifted itself out of the bureaucratic levels to become something that the president and the three prime ministers of these four countries are directly interested in. And I think it's actually about the only benefit that I can think of the pandemic was that it enabled the three prime ministers and the president to meet virtually, which they did in March this year. They agreed quite an ambitious agenda focused on vaccine delivery, supply chain security. So in other words, a bunch of non-military but important areas to cover nevertheless. And then we have, last week, as you say, the quite remarkable spectacle of seeing these four leaders gathering in Washington, DC. So I think this is going to give the Quad momentum. I think it's here to stay. I think the fact that China's been a little quiet about it is interesting, because usually China goes quiet when they're not entirely sure how they should be responding to these sorts of developments. And although Scott Morrison won't actually say it, it is, of course, all about China. But the fact that we've got, four of the most consequential democracies of the Indo-Pacific working together at head of government level, that's important. And I think we're going to hear a lot more from the Quad in future.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because Joe Biden seems to want the Quad to be mainly about climate and coronavirus. Meanwhile, AUKUS is about nuclear-powered submarines and cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles. Is this a shift away from the Trump administration interest in closer security ties with India towards a Biden administration interest in simply having a more civil relationship?
No, it's a good question, but I think what is happening with the Quad in particular is that they want to put the spin on a positive agenda, so that it's not going to be just about, we're here because we're worried about China, although that's undoubtedly true. But they also want to be saying to other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, we're showing you that there are different choices that you can make about how you organise your affairs that don't require you to be subordinating your interests to Beijing. And so, for example, the emphasis on foreign investment, I think, is an important thing, particularly for countries of Southeast Asia to benefit from. AUKUS is probably doing the harder yards around military technology. I think if you looked at the Quad and you took India out of it for the moment, the truth of the matter is that India is probably the most reluctant, most cautious of the Quad countries to engage. Remember, it has a long history of non-alignment, and that still has deep roots inside their foreign affairs establishment. But with Australia, Japan, and the United States, you've got a very effective trilateral grouping, which has been working incredibly closely and getting much closer over the last 10 or 15 years, which is going to be the engine of military cooperation in the Quad. And I think the extent to which we can bring India along with us, that's good, because we all feel that, India needs to play a bigger role and needs to be sort of inducted into thinking about its interests beyond the subcontinent. So I think that will be useful. But for the moment, an arrangement, I think, which has the Quad looking at less of an emphasis on military cooperation, although there is some of it, and more about supply chains and viruses and climate and that sort of thing. I think that's useful. And then AUKUS is going to be the bad cop on the block that's just reminding everybody that military power has a real purpose. That's the right division of responsibility, it seems to me.
Now, we have an exceptionally active chat today. Let me say some quick hellos to Ping, Tenzin, Michael, David, Bob, ZXCYBNM. We have everyone in the chat today. I'm not going to be able to get to everybody's questions, but Peter, I will ask you for some quick answers. Michael asks about to what extent will nuclear-powered submarines negate the need for a regional bomber? And he cites the retirement of the F-111s.
What we need in all of this military technology is increased range, and nuclear submarines give us increased range, although not necessarily speed. It probably won't surprise you, Salvatore, to know that I'm a fan of a bomber idea as well. The B-1B, immensely expensive aircraft, but that would transform what Australia could do with its air capability. I think having cracked the code on nuclear propulsion, it may well be possible for us to now start thinking about a longer range bomber type aircraft because its absence with the retirement of the F-111s has been frankly sorely missed. I just briefly mentioned cruise missiles. That is something which is going to give us a significant range too. So there is a partial compensation, but not complete, for not having that long-range bomber aircraft.
Okay. Christopher asks, might Japan be forced into nuclear deterrence, and whether that means a nuclear weapon or nuclear-powered ships as part of its defense stance?
I think the hope is that it won't have to be, but really the governing factor there is the believability of America's continued engagement in the security of the Asian region. If America was genuinely to go isolationist, I think it would put significant pressure on Tokyo to think about nuclear weapons. There is this thing called nuclear latency, which is how far away you are from a standing start, giving yourself the ability to produce nuclear weapons. And the truth of the matter is that Japan's not that far down the track if it really felt it had to. But for the security of the region, my view has always been that it's best for the Allies to sort of subcontract that to the United States and to strengthen the idea of extended nuclear deterrence, which has always been part of the American bargain for its alliance relationships in the region.
Well, on that note, David asks, will these nuclear-powered submarines have the capability to launch nuclear-armed missiles? And will their very existence increase the probability or the possibility of Australia eventually joining the nuclear weapons club in the future?
Look, I think capability is probably true. It used to be the case that back in the dark days of the Cold War that the US, for example, had a nuclear-armed torpedo. Well, you can certainly fire torpedoes out of these submarines. It will have a vertical launch system with the capacity to launch a cruise missile, it is possible for cruise missiles to be nuclear armed. So theoretically, yes, the submarine could play that role, as could almost any aircraft in the Australian Air Force today. The government's position remains that it has no interest in developing an onshore nuclear industry, and it has absolutely no interest in going down the track of developing nuclear weapons. I guess for as long as the alliance relationship with the US remains strong and credible, no Australian government should want to have that interest as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. So I don't think it's meaningfully in prospect yet. But, I say yet because it will always be driven by our strategic outlook. And depending on how grim things could get in the region, well, that might lead to a rethink. But at the moment, that's certainly not on anyone's agenda.
Now, I'm sorry to rush you, but we've had more questions than ever before, an unprecedented number of questions, and we're rapidly running out of time. Antony and Payne both want to know about Southeast Asian countries' reaction to AUKUS, in particular, Indonesia's.
Well, Indonesia made some comments to the effect that they didn't want to see an arms race develop as a result of this. And my view on that is too late, Indonesia. This has been galloping for a long time now, and Australia's not been driving it. It's been driven by China and its massive military expansion over the last 20 years. I thought actually the Indonesian response was fairly muted. I expected them not to sound particularly warm, but they weren't that negative about it either. And really what I think that tells us is that Indonesia is quite happy for Australia to be playing this role, for Australia to be spending its budget on these things, because in fact it does help to provide a sense of security inside Southeast Asia as well.
Yeah. Christopher asks, will China, or is it possible that China will move from a relatively low risk but opportunistic strategy to a more high risk confrontational strategy in its relations with Australia, United States, and Japan?
Since Xi Jinping has been in power, I think they have been following an increasingly risky strategy internationally. I'm thinking of the annexation of the islands in the South China Sea and the construction of military bases there. I'm thinking of their tearing up of the treaty agreement with the UK over Hong Kong's status, and the increasing way that they're threatening Taiwan and Japan. All of those things on the face of it are pretty risky. But the lessons for Xi Jinping so far is that he's been able to get away with them. The strength of the international response has not been coordinated or particularly good. And I think the lesson that Xi Jinping draws from that is risk is paying off. And I think we will see China seeking to take more risk to promote its strategic interests as it sees them in the future.
Bob, Fred, and I would all like to ask you about the third leg of AUKUS, that guy with the Queen and James Bond, Boris Karloff. We'd like to ask you about Boris Johnson and global Britain. And Bob Fred is particularly interested in the Kanzuk grouping. Could we see a stronger relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom and potentially Canada coming out of AUKUS?
Well, I think what Johnson is doing quite sensibly is he's looking for a foreign policy for Britain after Brexit, and that's where global Britain comes in. I'm not from that Canberra crowd of anti-UK folk that just keep sort of sneering at the Anglosphere. I think Britain is a country with global interests and some global capacity to pursue them, and the fact that they want to do that in partnership with us is great. On Canada, I would like to see Canada do more as a Pacific country, as an Indo-Pacific country. It just doesn't seem to want to have the interest to go that far at the moment. And I think what that tells you was that fundamentally Ottawa looks out across the Atlantic and sees NATO as its principal area of strategic interest. And for all whatever they may say, their rhetoric talks up a big Canadian game in the Pacific, but the reality is that they're just not that engaged.
Ali, Aiden, Donovan, thanks for your questions. We're not going to be able to get to them. Well, Donovan's we are. Tenzin, thanks for your question. We're not going to be able to get to it. But Donovan asks, picking up on your quote, your comment about New Zealand's quote anti-nuclear fantasies. Donovan asks, what's going on with New Zealand?
Oh gosh, New Zealand is a country which I think its strategic geography enables it to play a very lightly armed role in the world, narrowing its interests to the Pacific, South Pacific, which is what it's done, and really relying on Australia to do the heavy lifting as far as security in Asia is concerned. I think under the current New Zealand leadership, you've also got a government that wants to sort of posture internationally around climate and a range of other issues, and which has strategically taken the choice to acquiesce to China as one of New Zealand's most important markets. So New Zealand can afford to be snippy towards us because they know they'll be able to get away with it, deferential towards China, and underinvesting in all other respects in terms of its military security. I can't say that's a combination I'm particularly happy with, but nor is it new, Salvador. It's been around for a while, and I think we'll continue to see more of it.
Peter Jennings, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
Thanks also to our producer, Nico Malian. Our executive producer is Max Hawk-Weaver. The director of CIS is Tom Switzer. I'm Salvatore Babonis. Next week, I'll be talking to the Lowy Institute's Natasha Kassam on Taiwan, or at least on Taiwan relations. Thanks everyone for joining us, and you can find us this time next week on Liberty.